Hey everybody, we're gonna play a song for you by Jesse Fuller, and you may know he was a one-man band, street musician, and I'm gonna read a little more coherently from my phone, if that's okay. So Fuller was born in Jonesboro, Georgia, near Atlanta, sent by his mother to live with foster parents when he was a young child in a rural setting where he was badly mistreated. All right, we'll skip all that. In the 1920s, he lived in Southern California, opened a hot dog stand, and was befriended by Douglas Fairbanks. He worked briefly as a film extra in The Thief of Baghdad and East of Suez. He moved to Oakland in 1929. He's famous for this song we're about to play you. He's a one-man band, so I suggest you YouTube Jesse Fuller, and he wrote this song called The San Francisco Bay Blues. Phil's gonna start it. Well, I got the blues from my baby left me by the San Francisco Bay. The ocean liner's gone so far away. I didn't mean to treat her so bad. She was the best girl I ever had. Well, she said goodbye, she made me cry. I wanna lay down and die. Well, I ain't got a nickel, I ain't got a lousy dime. She don't come back, I think I'm gonna lose my mind. If she ever gets back to stay, well, it's gonna be a brand new day. I'll be walking with my baby by the San Francisco Bay. I'll take it, Phil. Well, I'm sitting here looking from my back door, wondering which way to go. A woman I'm so crazy about, she don't love me no more. I think I'm gonna catch a freight train, 'cause I'm feeling blue. Right all the way to the end of the line, thinking only of you. Meanwhile, in another city, I'm just about to go insane. I thought I heard the only girl I ever loved. I thought I heard her call my name. Well, if I ever get back to stay, gonna be a brand new day. I'll be walking with my baby by the San Francisco Bay. Oh yeah, I'll be walking with my baby down by the San Francisco Bay. Walking with my baby down by the San Francisco Bay. Jesse Fuller.
Can you hear me? Good evening. Welcome to the Mill Valley Library. My name is Deborah Schwartz, and I'm in charge of the oral history program and the first Wednesday speaker series for the Mill Valley Historical Society. And we're so happy to have you here today. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have the wonderful and witty author and columnist Gary Kamiya, and special musical guests who just started the evening for us, Matt Lax and Phil Richardson. We wanted to start this evening and get ourselves in the mood for everything San Francisco. First, as always, I would just like to say that the Historical Society would like to thank the library for allowing us to host our talks here at the Mill Valley Library. It's just beautiful. Thank you. One of the ways we like to show our appreciation is by helping the library restore this room to order after the presentation, so we'd love to have your help with that, putting the chairs back on racks and bringing the furniture back, that is all piled up over there, back to its original position, and the library will help us. So thanks in advance for that. The Mill Valley Historical Society would also like to thank our members. How many here are members? That just is beautiful. Our memberships, for those that aren't, our memberships, which are very modest, less than $20, allows us to put on programs such as this. It helps us with our annual history walk and the plaques we put up into town, and all the ways that we try to enrich our town with the history and the culture that we like to preserve and feel obliged to preserve for all of you. So if you aren't a member, please, you can see there's a table over there with Stella and Jill, and they'll be happy to help you sign up. Gary's talk, it will last a little less than an hour. And after that, we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. And then, so I ask you to please hold your questions till then. And then it'll be time to put the room back in order, and Gary will have books to sell and sign for you, and the Historical Society also has some wonderful books for you too. Now a little bit about Gary Kamiya. A taxi driver for 7 years, and later a peripatetic historian and writer, Gary Kamiya is the author of one of my very favorite books, the best-selling Cool Gray City of Love, 49 Views of San Francisco, which was awarded the 2013 Northern California Book Award in Creative Nonfiction. Cool Gray City of Love is curious and evocative, soulfully written, with adjectives that pelt you like cool water droplets on a hot day, both refreshing and surprising. Gary's first book was the critically acclaimed Shadow Knights, The Secret War Against Hitler. He was founder and longtime executive editor of the pioneering website, Salon.com, and the former executive editor of San Francisco Magazine. His work has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Sports Illustrated, ArtForum, Mother Jones, Sierra, and many other publications. His histories columns, Portals of the Past, who reads that here? Yeah. Appears every Saturday in the San Francisco Chronicle. But what about Gary himself? I asked him earlier today, could he tell me a little something that we wouldn't be able to learn from reading the inside of his book or in one of his stories? And he did have a little story to share. This is a pretty good one, actually. One of the formative events of Gary's life was when at 18 he dropped out of Yale. And with a black friend from Berkeley High, boarded a Greyhound bus, Newport News, Virginia Newport, because a Yale buddy had said that he could get a job at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock, a huge military and private shipyard. Well, after he worked there for a few months, he came back to work with his father, one of the inventors of biofeedback. Remember that? And the owner of a very successful waterbed company hired Gary's dad to do a scientific sleep study to see if people slept better on waterbeds. And Gary was the primary and only researcher. And the results, would you like to know the results? How many say yes? How many say no? Yes? No? Well, in fact, the results were inconclusive. And so, naturally, Gary went on to finish school at UC Berkeley with a degree in English, and the rest is history. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Gary Kamiya.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you to the musicians for that wonderful and funky and soulful San Francisco song, which I confess I had never heard of before. Which is like lame, but it's a great weird, kind of deeply, funky and personal song. It's not just you're sitting by the dock of the bay or God help us, Eric Burdon, which when I was growing up in the Bay Area, that song really irritated me. It wasn't quite as bad as what was the one that was Scott something? If you're going to San Francisco, that was like the dragnet version of, I don't know if any of you ever saw the LSD story or the marijuana story, but it was about that level of hipness about San Francisco. But this song actually felt like, okay, this dude, some woman broke his heart. And there's even a slight tie-in to the chapter that I'm going to read from this book. I wouldn't say my heart was exactly broken by this woman, but it was definitely a letdown of some sort. But anyway, so this book, as some of you probably know, is formatted with 49 different chapters because of the iconic number 49 in San Francisco. San Francisco is actually not 49 square miles. That's a myth. It's actually 46 square miles. But it does have 1849 as the annus mirabilis of the gold rush. So these 49 chapters, my idea was to just select 49 physical locations and write and just do a deep dive into them. And some of them I would have lots of strange personal experiences in. Some of them I would do crazy amounts of research. Some of them I would do a lot of journalistic reporting on. Some of them would be some of them would be like faked. But it was an attempt to provide a sense of my years and decades of wandering through the city, physically walking through it, as well as trying to learn as much as I could about everything that I saw. So Deborah, who so kindly invited me up to do this, invited me also to stay in her cabin up on the flank of Mount Tam, and I just took about a 2-hour... Not a bribe. Yeah, right, not a bribe. I just took about a 2-hour walk on Mount Tam just before this reading, and was thinking the whole time, man, the Bay Area is really an interesting place because this is one of the most sublime walks you can have anywhere in the world. And what I'm going to read to you about is radically different. This is a chapter, it's the second chapter in the book, actually. The first chapter of the book is about the Farallon Islands. And I intentionally wanted to open it in the Farallon Islands because, as few people know, the Farallons are actually part of the city and county of San Francisco. If they ran the avenues out there, they would be like 400th Avenue or something. They're way out there, like, 28 miles off the coast. And I wanted to start with them because, to me, what separates San Francisco from all other great world cities is it's the extremity of its natural setting, the stunning contrasts and nakedness of the rock and of the terrain. And is it better now? Oh, okay. I had a sense that it somehow moved at some point, and it may move again. I think it may have just moved there. But anyway, so one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was to do kind of a cinematic thing where you start out in the Tenderloin, start out in the Farallons, and the next chapter will be the Tenderloin, which is the diametrical opposite of the Farallons. It's the absolute antithesis of it, and yet in its own weird way, maybe it's a little bit like the Farallons too. So without further ado, I'm going to read chapter 2 from Cool Gray City, which is called Adventures in the Skin Trade. And every chapter has an address, and this address would have to be Turk and Taylor Streets, which used to be the home of the 21 Club, one of the great bars in San Francisco, but it's not there anymore. In the universe of San Francisco, the Tenderloin is the black hole, the 6-block by 6-block area where the city's urban matter is most intensely concentrated. It is the only part of San Francisco that remains untamed, its last human wilderness. Without the Tenderloin and its radioactive core of junkies, drunks, transvestites, dealers, thugs, madmen, hustlers, derelicts, prostitutes, and lowlifes, this overpriced, increasingly homogeneous burg would feel like one of those motel bathrooms that are Santa-sealed for your protection. The Tenderloin is the creepy Mr. Hyde, which happens to be the name of a street running through it, to the rest of San Francisco's respectable Dr. Jekyll. And there actually is a Jekyll Hotel in the Tenderloin. And this evil twin isn't hidden away in some asylum on the outskirts of town. The Tenderloin is surrounded by Union Square, Nob Hill, the Civic Center, and the rapidly gentrifying mid-market district. It's about as central as you can get. This is weird. Many cities used to have bad neighborhoods in the heart of downtown, zones of misrule where the primal human urges to get laid, to get high, and to get money were allowed to bloom furtively in the night. But most of them are gone now, victims of gentrification. New York Times Square feels like Disneyland. Vancouver's gas town has been tamed. Boston's combat zone was rendered hors de combat years ago. And of those that remain, none take up 36 square blocks of prime real estate in the middle of one of the most expensive cities in the world. Union Square is the center of San Francisco's downtown, the quintessential public space of any corporate city 2013. And it has become far more corporate since 2013. An invisible capitalist force field. In the beginning was the logo, and the logo was with God, and the logo was God, emanates down from the airline and Midori touting billboards looming up over it. But you only have to walk a couple of blocks from the square's bustling southwest corner at Geary and Powell to find yourself in a lurid demimonde populated by characters out of a Dennis Johnson novel. All of which is to say that the Tenderloin is a large turd, often a literal one, floating in the crystal punch bowl that is San Francisco. So why is it still here? Because the city wants it to be here. For decades, the Tenderloin has been carefully protected by the city and various nonprofit organizations. It's not that these officials, social workers, homeless advocates, and low-cost housing activists want to maintain a zone of crime and filth in the heart of San Francisco. It's simply an inescapable consequence of their laudable commitment to defend society's most vulnerable members. The problem is that by saving the baby, you also save the bathwater. No one has figured out a way to help the deserving poor, to use the condescending 19th century parlance, without also helping the creepy, kooky, and dangerous poor. The result is, in effect, a protected urban wildlife zone, a bottle city of squalor. But the Tenderloin is more than that. It is also a memorial to a rich and vanished era, what geographer Richard Walker has called the high tide of dense urbanism. And there was a bar called the High Tide at the corner of Geary and Leavenworth. For it was here, in the neighborhood's unique collection of single-room occupancy, SRO, hotels and apartment houses, that the great army that once made up the blood and guts and sinew of American cities lived. Tens of thousands of clerks and salesmen and stenographers and hobos and longshoremen and cops and dressmakers and carpenters and factory workers inhabited these cheap but decent rooming houses. Most of them were single. Many of them were women. They were drawn to the city because they could find work here. As Paul Groth writes in Living Downtown, The History of Residential Hotels in the United States, for these newcomers, inexpensive rooming houses offered freedom, anonymity, and sexual liberation, all in the heart of the city. What is remarkable about the Tenderloin is that it has remained physically unchanged for more than 80 years. It is a time capsule. The same progressive forces that have kept out progress and inadvertently created a museum of depravity have also created a museum of the lost city, a vanished world memorialized in the neighborhood's extraordinary collection of residential hotels. There are hundreds of these historic SROs in the Tenderloin, the largest number in the world. The SROs are the reason that in 2008, the Uptown Tenderloin was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, the 24th San Francisco neighborhood to be so listed. All of these 3 to 7 story brick and masonry buildings were built between 1906 and the Great Depression. Almost all of them are essentially unchanged, right down to their blade signs. These once elegant buildings have fallen on very hard times, but they still conjure up the romance and mystery of the naked city with its 8 million stories. They are the ultimate urban hives. In an uncanny way, the Museum of Depravity helps bring the Museum of the Lost City to life. If all of those rooming houses were occupied by employees of Twitter, and that day may be coming, the ghostly romance of the Tenderloin's past would not feel quite as rich and strange. The very first time I set foot in the Tenderloin was when I was a 17-year-old student at Berkeley High School. I went with my friend Ben, this is the same guy I took the Greyhound bus to Newport News with, a black guy who smoked Cools and read Heidegger, over to the big city from Berkeley to meet up with a pal of his for some reason I have forgotten. We went into an old apartment building, took the elevator up, and walked into a studio apartment that looked out over downtown. It was the first time I had ever been in an apartment. I dimly remember that it was airy and spacious. There are a lot of beautiful rooms in those old buildings. But my memory is somewhat cloudy because his friend pulled out a water pipe, another first, and we proceeded to get stoned. This was an appropriate introduction to the Tenderloin. A long-haired, half-Japanese dude and 2 black guys interrupting their vague urban mission to puff away on a water pipe, unless that was the mission. The die was cast. Most of my subsequent experiences in the Tenderloin have involved some kind of sin. I got to know the Tenderloin during the 7 years I was a taxi driver in San Francisco. Sin and taxi driving go together like gin and tonic. And the Tenderloin was the smudged highball glass where they mixed. The loin was ground zero for sex, the sub-basement of the lower chakras. Sex radiated out of its innumerable windows and filthy sidewalks from Frenchie's K&T bookstore. The name Frenchie, a subtle tip-off as to the types of books it carried, to the gaudy, teetering whores on Gary Street. From the bottom of the barrel all-night mini-adult theater on the lunar corner of Golden Gate and Jones. Admission, $2. No charge for an attempted blowjob by the drunken homeless guy who just sat down next to you. To the scary last exit to Brooklyn drag queens on Larkin, from the gay male hustlers hanging outside the Peter Pan bar on Mason near Market, an intersection delicately known as the meat rack, to Jim and Artie Mitchell's upscale flesh joint on O'Farrell Street. There was a major cross-dressing and transgender scene in the TL, catered to by unnerving bars like the Black Rose. One night at about 2 a.m., I picked up a 30-ish straight man on O'Farrell Street. He was pretty drunk. He was a nice guy who seemed completely freaked out. He started babbling as soon as he sat down. "Oh my God," he said, "the weirdest thing just happened to me. I picked up this girl and she turned out not to be a girl." He had gone drunkenly through with the sexual encounter anyway, and now he needed to exorcise the whole bizarre incident. I tried to reassure him that he would be okay, but he was as jangled and jumpy as if he had just poured 10 cups of espresso into his id. The Tenderloin was often involved in these libidinous journeys, either as a starting point or a destination. 2 Japanese salarymen once asked me to take them to something that sounded like "Haibasho." I had no idea what they were talking about. They had to repeat it twice until I realized they were saying "ribald show." I felt like calling up the editors of the OED and reporting the first conversational use of the word ribald since 1911. I took them to the Mitchell brothers. Say what you will about Japanese businessmen, they are not self-conscious about sex. Indeed, for some of them, it appeared that having a naked woman shove her ass in their faces was a tourist activity, to be checked off the to-do list, on a par with visiting the Legion of Honor or Golden Gate Park. During a trip to a slightly sleazier flesh pot than the Mitchell brothers, the New Century on Larkin, if memory serves, I was surprised to suddenly hear a piercing whistle. I looked away from the gyrating woman on the pole to observe 10 or 15 Japanese men getting up and moving methodically toward the exit, heading back to the tour bus. It was the finest display of organized horniness I'd ever seen. I myself was a master of disorganized horniness. I once met a lunatic stripper who worked at one of the Loin's legendary strip clubs, the Chez Paris on Mason, famous for its neon sign of a long female leg bent and ready to kick the can-can. I met this woman on the beach at Aquatic Park and took her the next day to Lake Anza in Berkeley. Unfortunately, her spectacular body turned out to be accompanied by a schizophrenic brain. We were sitting on our towels talking about this and that when she suddenly and suspiciously asked me if I was gay. Apparently, trying to make innocuous first date conversation was a bad move. Later, we did manage to get in a little groping in the back seat of my stepmom's 1962 VW Bug. It was pretty hot, but in the middle of it, she suddenly pulled a hairbrush out of her purse and began utilizing it in a way for which it was not designed. That would have been all right. In fact, it would have been all right to an unparalleled degree, except for the fact that, one, it felt like she had suddenly gone into her Chez Paris routine, and two, I couldn't convince her to come back to my apartment. When I dropped her off at her apartment in the Tenderloin, she told me to come by the Chez Paris after 2 a.m. when she got off work. So I did. I waited for half an hour. But the only person who came out was a large, violent-looking bouncer who told me to get lost. Hairbrush woman, in the extremely unlikely event that you are reading this, where did I go wrong? In addition to being haunted by such crackpot Circes, the Tenderloin also featured, and still does, more than its share of young males whose approach to life is summed up by the line delivered by the blackmailing George Sanders character in Rebecca. I'd like to have your advice on how to live comfortably without working hard. Two of these worthies, one a tattooed white guy who had long hair of the non-hippie kind, and one an ominous-looking Latino blood, hailed me on Taylor and Eddy one night. I was a fairly new driver, and it was a slow night, so when they said they wanted to go to the airport, I agreed. Tilt. Taxi commandment number 1. Do not pick up scary dudes in the Tenderloin who look like they just got out of the joint and say they want to go to the airport even though they have no luggage. Taxi commandment number 2. If one of these scary dudes gets in the front seat and one gets in the back, directly behind you, so you cannot observe the gun he is pulling out, immediately defecate in your pants, exit the vehicle, and run screaming down the street. Unfortunately, I failed to follow either of these easy rules. Instead, I drove down 6th Street and got on the freeway. After a minute or two, I felt the unpleasant sensation of a gun barrel pushing up against the back of my head. I was informed by the muscly San Jose speed freak white dude in the front seat that this is a stick-up. They made me drive around while they looked for a remote place. And they got kind of chummy as we rolled along. Blood in the back seat said, "Hey, you drive pretty good. You ever think about a life of crime?" Laugh? I thought I'd die. Finally, they told me to exit at Colma and had me drive into the vast city of the dead, where Wyatt Earp is buried in a cemetery called Hills of Eternity. I did not like this at all. They told me to get out of the car. I jumped out and sprinted down the road, screaming, "Help!" while waiting for the bullets to rip into my back. But the only sound was the engine roaring as they drove off at top speed. The SF police soon came and picked me up. This turned out to be almost as arduous an ordeal as the robbery and kidnapping, because as we headed back to the city, they suddenly got a radio call about some heavy crime that had just gone down in the Geneva Towers, the scariest projects in town, designed by Eichler, if you can believe it, before they were blown up in 1998, physically blown up. They took off at 90 miles an hour toward Visitation Valley. As we approached the terrifying high-rises, the cop riding shotgun actually pulled out, yes, a shotgun, and stuck it out the window. When the radio said the suspect was a black male, the driver sneered, "Oh yeah, that's a big fucking surprise." They were total macho cowboys, but considering they were working the Geneva Towers beat during the crack-crazed 1980s, which would have to qualify as one of the worst jobs in the history of the world, I had to cut them a little slack. They finally dropped me off at the yellow cab lot. The next day, the cab turned up hidden in an old railway cutting at the base of Potrero Hill, just a few blocks away. If you were to throw a ball 1,000 feet into the air from here, Peter Field told me as we stood on the corner of O'Farrell and Mason, wherever it landed, the chances are it would hit a building that was once involved in some kind of illegal activity. Field probably knows more about the Tenderloin than anyone else. A social worker who worked in the neighborhood for 12 years, he himself slept on the streets for a while when he first came to town. He evinces the no bullshit kindness of a man who has been exposed to the darkest side of humanity, yet hasn't given up hope. Field is obsessed with the Tenderloin's history. He has spent hundreds of hours poring over city directories and Sanborn insurance maps, the sources that allow sleuths to follow the convoluted trails of people and businesses through the vanished urban landscape. I came upon some pieces he'd written about the TL online and called him up. He gives a walking tour of the neighborhood twice a year through City Guides, a nonprofit organization whose volunteer guides lead tours all over town. I had just missed his tour, but he offered to take me around. His normal tour lasts about 2.5 hours. We spent 6.5 hours walking about 6 blocks. I met Field at the dead center of San Francisco, the Powell Street cable car turnaround at Eddy Street. It was a hot June Sunday, and thousands of tourists and locals were swarming the streets. But they soon faded into the background as Field drew me into a lost world of lonely merchant sailors in sad rooms, old people eating in white tablecloth cafeterias, thousands of excited men on Ellis waiting for a boxer to emerge from a weigh-in, evil pimps drugging girls, French restaurants with discreet upstairs rooms, Miles Davis riffing with Wynton Kelly at the Black Hawk, military shore patrols, and San Francisco's finest scouring the streets together looking for AWOL sailors, homeless kids selling their bodies on the corner of Geary and Polk, hobos returning to the same shabby hotels for decades. By the end of the 6.5 hours, it felt as if I had just watched a time-lapse film of the neighborhood's entire long, rich life. Like most of old San Francisco, the Tenderloin was once a wasteland of sand dunes and scrub brush. Its first white inhabitant was a viticulturist named Henry Gerke, who in 1847 built a 2-story building at Eddy and Mason, the streets did not yet exist, near a large spring-fed pond that stood where the Flood building is today. The isolated area was known as St. Anne's Valley. It was only 3/4 of a mile to the center of town, the old Spanish Plaza, which had been renamed Portsmouth Square after the American conquest of California in 1846. But the dunes were so high and deep that it was a long hike to get there. A saloon called St. Anne's Rest appeared in the 1850s, catering to travelers on their way to old Mission Dolores. But there were few inhabitants until 1860, when the Market Street Railway opened, its path cleared by steam paddies, steam-powered excavating machines that were given that politically incorrect name because they could supposedly do the work of 20 Irishmen. By 1866, the former wasteland was completely developed. It was a typical San Francisco neighborhood of homes and small businesses with a few mansions scattered here and there. The event most responsible for turning the Tenderloin into what Field called San Francisco's premier entertainment and vice district took place in 1878, when an entrepreneur named Lucky Baldwin built the opulent Baldwin Hotel at Powell and Market. This first-class hostelry, which competed with the famous Palace Hotel a few blocks east, included a theater. Other theaters and music halls followed, along with office buildings. This brought new customers into the neighborhood, Field said. Rich rancher Johnnies, rich town Johnnies, office workers. Following the law of supply and demand, in 1884, the neighborhood's first parlor house, a genteel brothel, opened at 223 Ellis, presided over by a Miss Inez Leonard of Virginia City. Others soon followed. By the 1890s, the Tenderloin had been transformed from a stolid middle-class neighborhood into a jumping district of theaters, hotels, parlor houses, restaurants, many of which doubled as brothels or places of assignation, and gambling joints. As we spoke, a young guy with a scar on his face lurched up and demanded to know what we were talking about. When we wouldn't tell him, he punished us by releasing a toxic cloud of Royal Gate vodka fumes in our faces. The court said I was not allowed to own a pencil or anything to write with. Do you know why? He asked. Receiving no answer, he stumbled off. Sex was a prime Tenderloin draw, just as it was for San Francisco's more famous red light district, the Barbary Coast, near the waterfront on Pacific. But the two flesh pots were completely different. The Tenderloin was more refined than the Barbary Coast, Field said. The Barbary Coast attracted sailors and some upper-class men going slumming. But the Tenderloin attracted all classes. You could go out to dinner, go to the theater, and then maybe stop in at a parlor house. The semi-respectable nature of the neighborhood was solidified when it became the center of San Francisco's fraternal societies, the Odd Fellows, the Masons, the Elks, and so on. These societies would have their monthly or yearly meetings here, and the men would want to have a good time, Field said. They'd wander around the neighborhood, go to the bars and parlor houses. The newspapers of the time are filled with stories about men who lost their fraternal diamond stick pins in the neighborhood. We walked up to the corner of Ellis and Powell. East on Ellis, where a parking lot now stands, was a saloon and betting parlor owned by Harry Corbett, the brother of Gentleman Jim Corbett, the former heavyweight champion of the world. This was the center of betting parlors in San Francisco, Field said. Corbett became a boxing promoter and had his own set of scales on a Turkish rug. When you made it as a boxer, you weighed in on his scales. Ellis Street would be crowded with men waiting to get a look at their heroes, men like Bob Fitzsimmons and Sailor Sharkey. The joint was raided repeatedly by the police. After 1906, it was rebuilt as a French restaurant with private rooms upstairs, a San Francisco tradition. The purpose of these rooms was made clear by the discreet behavior of the waiters, who were trained not to enter the rooms unless summoned. The great earthquake and fire of 1906 destroyed the Tenderloin, along with all of downtown San Francisco. The post-quake reconstruction was responsible for the Tenderloin's unique architectural character. Its buildings had mostly been 1 or 2 story wooden houses and small hotels. The new buildings were higher, 3 to 7 stories, made of brick or masonry, and they had many more units, mostly studios. Into this densely built up, compact area, close to offices and factories and restaurants and bars, poured the 1920s and 1930s equivalent of the young people who today work as baristas or retail clerks and live in the Mission District, or maybe, mutatis mutandis, those who work at the Home Depot and live in San Leandro, clerks and salesmen and barbers and firemen. Starting in the 1920s, as Paul Groth notes, women began to move to the rooming houses in large numbers. Until salaries for stenographers rose in the 1920s, women did not make enough money to be able to live alone. For the sheltered young American men and women who found themselves bumping into each other in the hall on the way to the bathroom, the Tenderloin and similar cheap downtown neighborhoods offered the chance to break free of Victorian small-town sexual codes. The sinful side of the neighborhood flourished openly until it was forced into hiding by the U.S. military, which was alarmed by sky-high rates of venereal disease among soldiers and by prohibition. Sin City prospered even in hiding, but a double whammy set it on the road to decline. The big hotels in the southeast Tenderloin were banking on being part of the theater district, but after the quake, most of the theaters moved north to Geary and O'Farrell, Field said. The hotels had to readjust their sites to a lower class of tenants. Then the Depression hit and caused upkeep and maintenance on the buildings to go down. Despite the building's decline, it was still clinging to respectability. By the 1930s, the typical Tenderloin resident in one of the SROs was a transient worker, a hobo, or a step up from a hobo, someone who worked seasonally harvesting crops or in manufacturing. There were also a lot of merchant seamen. Bums had not yet appeared. Some seasonal farm workers returned to the same rooming houses for 50 years. When World War II came, the TL prospered again with all the military around, Field went on. But after the war, it slumped again. It briefly picked up again during the Korean War. In the 1940s and 1950s, you have military shore patrols cruising through the area side by side with regular police. Horny GIs were keeping the Tenderloin on life support. But in the 1950s, a number of things happened that sent it into a death spiral. Swing music played by big bands had drawn crowds into TL clubs. When the big band era ended, those clubs lost most of their audience. Bebop, the more harmonically advanced jazz that succeeded swing, was not nearly as popular. And the rise of folk music drew away still more paying customers. The last jazz club in the Tenderloin, the legendary Black Hawk at Turk and Hyde, where Miles Davis recorded 2 classic albums in April 1961, went out of business in 1963. At the same time, the remaining theaters in the area, which had switched to showing movies instead of live shows, began to go downhill, becoming grindhouses. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's population was getting older and poorer. The residents were aging and retired seniors living on limited means, Field said. The big cafeterias where the people of the Tenderloin used to eat, Clinton's and Compton's, which in their heyday had table service, also began their final descent. When SROs were raised in other San Francisco neighborhoods in the early 1960s, their poor residents had nowhere to go except to the Tenderloin. In the 1930s, the papers started calling this a seedy neighborhood, Field said. By the 1950s, it was a very seedy neighborhood. By the 1960s, a euphemism had appeared. It was a central city neighborhood. The cultural upheavals of the 1960s sent runaways flooding into the Tenderloin. These boys and girls, the lost souls of the flower generation, hung out on street corners, doing drugs and prostituting themselves. The few working-class residents of the Tenderloin moved out as manufacturing jobs left the city. The housing stock deteriorated further. Then thousands of social outcasts flooded in during the 1960s and 1970s as prisoners were released from overcrowded jails and the mentally ill were deinstitutionalized. These people became a customer base for drug dealers, hustlers, and street criminals, Field said. In the 1980s, the Tenderloin became increasingly black. The first homeless in the neighborhood were mentioned in the Tenderloin Times, the local newspaper, in 1984. The 80s are when the Tenderloin actually becomes dangerous, Field said, when I started to work here. We turned down Taylor Street and approached the corner of Turk. A half a dozen people were milling around in front of a doorway. This is the Tenderloin's own private jail, Field said. I looked more closely at the crowd. It was mostly young Latino men. One guy was wearing a Steelers jersey and gesticulating. They gave off a familiar sense of confused desperation mingled with bravado. To get in there, you have to show ID, have a reason to be there, and go through all kinds of security, Field said. It's run by a company that contracts with the state of California to house parolees, people on probation awaiting trial. It's cheaper for the state to keep them here. As we spoke, a young Latino guy a few feet away was talking on a cell phone. I paid no attention, but Field had street ears. Did you hear what that guy just said? Do you think he recognized me? That's typical of the conversations you'll hear on this corner. An ominous Indian-looking guy, dressed all in black, swaggered past us on Taylor, exuding a major don't fuck with me vibe. Field had street eyes, too. Did you see that? Field said under his breath, pointing at the guy's leg. A knife at least 10 inches long was tightly strapped against his thigh. I don't think that's legal, I said. Yeah, well, maybe no one will notice, Field said dryly. It kind of goes with his outfit. I asked Field what he thought was going to happen to the neighborhood. The Tenderloin is the last battleground, he said. For nonprofit housing outfits and social services, this is Fort Apache. It's Custer's last stand. Historically, poor people and improving neighborhoods don't mix. Either the poor people move out or the neighborhood collapses. The Tenderloin is a case of the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. As a historian, I'm curious to see if the Tenderloin can resist the forces that always win out in cities. An example of the irresistible force was the impending gentrification, green-lighted by the late Mayor Ed Lee, of the blighted mid-Market Street area. Spearheading the assault on this legendarily bleak and intractable stretch was Twitter, which in June 2012 moved 800 employees into a building between 9th and 10th Streets. Though mid-market is only on the Tenderloin's borders, the move was a portent. It struck me as ironic that a social media company specializing in creating disembodied communities might simultaneously destroy and revitalize the neighborhood that had once been a dense nexus of city life. The immovable object, the thing keeping the Tenderloin from being gentrified, is a combination of city policy and nonprofit housing entities, both dedicated to providing extremely low-cost housing and services in the heart of San Francisco. If it were not for these factors, the Tenderloin would probably look like any other revitalized downtown neighborhood, a high-priced 2013 version of Jane Jacobs' urbanist utopia. The city made two crucial decisions, Field said. In 1981, it passed a law forbidding owners from demolishing SROs or converting them into tourist rentals unless they replaced the converted units or paid a fee into a fund for affordable housing. Then, in 1985, it imposed height limits on new buildings in the Tenderloin, preventing Manhattanization. These decisions, combined with its active enforcement of existing rent laws, in particular those preventing eviction of existing tenants, and its purchase of some SRO buildings, have helped keep market forces out of the Tenderloin. Just as significant, nonprofits like the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation and the Tenderloin Housing Clinic have purchased or leased many SRO hotels in the neighborhood, providing subsidized housing and social services for people who meet their criteria, those who are poor, disabled, have substance abuse problems, etc. Field said their rent is typically 1/3 of their monthly income. And since most of them are on SRI, which is about $880 a month, a lot of the people living in the Tenderloin are paying $200 or $300 a month rent. The median asking rent in San Francisco in December 2012 was $3,100. I don't know what it is now, but it's probably $1,000 more than that, making it the most expensive U.S. city in which to rent. As we stood on the corner, a young black guy stumbled up to us. "What are you doing?" he demanded, pointing to my notebook. "We're just talking," Field said. No, the guy said. "You come down here to my neighborhood, you gotta..." "Look, my friend, it's my neighborhood too," Field said. "It belongs to all of us." When he told the guy he had worked here for 12 years and had himself briefly slept on the streets when he first arrived, the guy's jive bluster deflated like a pricked balloon. He seemed abashed and didn't know what to say. We both shook his hand and he wandered off. Field was deeply conflicted about what he wanted to see happen in the Tenderloin. As a social worker, I want to do everything in my power to protect these people from the landlords who would throw them out, he said. They're evil motherfuckers. But as a San Franciscan, as a guy who likes to walk, I want all this stuff cleaned up. He was sick of the crime, the prostitution. As a social worker, I see absolutely no redeeming value in it, he said. The filth, the drugs. When I give my tours, Fields went on, I ask how many people live in the Tenderloin. More and more people say they do. They're in their 30s and their 40s. They've been living here a few years. They're invested in the neighborhood. Okay, they go off to work and they relax. And when they come home, they get tense. How long will this go on? And then there are all the Southeast Asians with kids who have moved into the neighborhood. How long will they put up with this? In the end, Field came down on the side of letting the Tenderloin be. I've got my dark glasses on so you can't see me blushing, he said. But God help me, I do see it as romantic. The tour was over, and I said goodbye to Field. I was glad that he had been my Virgil on this tour of San Francisco's purgatory. His ambivalence about the Tenderloin mirrored my own. Like him, I found it appalling and fascinating and consummately strange. And like him, I could not imagine San Francisco without it. I went down Mason, turned on Turk, and headed toward the setting sun. People were milling around in front of a defunct old porno arcade. It was still warm, but a cool wind was kicking in from the west. I looked up at the rows of hotels and apartments, once elegant buildings, where countless ordinary working people had lived. All those vanished lives seemed to have sunk into their shabby lobbies and blank windows. In a city without memory, they were still here. There was a sadness about them as they stood there in the harsh, slanting rays of the late afternoon sun. But it was a good sadness, like the peeled apple that falls from the Father's hand at the end of Ozu's late spring. A sadness to keep. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Do we have any questions? No.
Yes.
So you like it or you don't like it?
I like it, you know.
What do you like about it?
I like that it's crazy. It's
Still live in the city?
oh yeah, still live in the city. I live on Telegraph Hill. Yeah. But you know, I go into the Tenderloin all the time still. It's crazy. I mean, it's just I think anyone has a love-hate feeling about it, you know.
I write the city supervisor to have them rename the neighborhood Scuzzville.
Yeah, that's pretty appropriate. Yeah, that's true. Yes? Yes.
Question.
The question was, how did the tenderloin get its name? And there's various theories about that, but supposedly there was a police sergeant, I think it was originally in New York, and he had gotten transferred to a more profitable beat where he could rake off more earnings from local vice enterprises. And he said, well, I've been eating chuck steak, but now I'm going to be eating tenderloin. Apparently that got transferred to San Francisco's tenderloin. So, go ahead. Yes?
Is Glide Memorial Church the biggest political force in the Tenderloin?
So the question is Glide Memorial Church the biggest political force in the Tenderloin? No. I mean, they're a big political force, although they're having enormous controversy now because they're having a fight with the Mother Church, between the Mother Church and the Glide as created by Cecil Williams and Janice Mirakatani. But they're a huge player because they provide so many social services and they're very politically connected. But I think the biggest political players are probably the Tenderloin Housing Clinic and the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, that they own so much real estate. So, you know, the reason that the Tenderloin, as I tried to make clear in that chapter, the reason it's such an anomaly for world cities is that the nonprofits actually control the real estate and they have the backing of the city. So Glide is part of that equation, but those other places are maybe even more important.
Would it be fair to call them part of the homeless industrial complex?
I mean, it depends. I mean, that interpretation of the social service agencies is very cynical. And I think cynicism is not always completely misplaced. You know, I'm not a naive person about how money flows and can perpetuate itself and not always is spent in the best way. But I think it's a little too cynical to say that. I think most of the folks that work in those nonprofits, it's not like they're making huge bucks. I mean, it's really grinding, thankless work. You're dealing with people that are not just triple diagnosed, as I've done a lot of reporting on homelessness, but a lot of homeless people are quadruple diagnosed. So not only are they sick, physically sick, mentally ill, and have substance abuse problems, but they also have cognitive disorders, like somebody hit them in the head with a 2x4. So if you say go and get your meds on Wednesday, they can't do it because they don't know what Wednesday is. This is not easy work. So, you know, yeah, there is a homeless industrial complex, and it could be more efficient, but it's not as if it's, you know, just a bunch of people scamming out. I mean, I think there are plenty of people scamming out on different do-gooder things, but I think that that's too harsh in general. Right? Yes?
I worked in the Tenderloin. I worked at Laguna Honda Hospital for 22 years, so I spent a lot of time down there.
Yeah.
And all you're saying is true. But the Department of Justice had a lot to do with the Tenderloin turning into what it is today, as well as the Tenderloin housing being formed. They already were, but they went hand in hand with the DOJ to provide better services for those quadruple diagnosed.
So the point was that you're saying the DOJ. Well, what was it that the DOJ did that influenced it?
Well, first they came to Laguna Honda and said we weren't discharging enough people.
Oh.
That these people could be out in the community.
Oh, I see. Oh, so this is deinstitutionalization.
Yeah.
Right.
But,
Right.
and so then but then they realized, which we already knew, that the services weren't out there for them.
Right, I see.
So they started placing more health care, maybe only once or twice a week in some of the housing units paid for by the city and then later turned over to other Tenderloin housing.
Right.
And some of the rebuilds too.
Right.
And so there were some brand new ones in Mission.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Yeah. Yes.
You know, would you say that the Golden Gate Theater kind of backs up to the Tenderloin? Or
Sure.
the edge of it?
Yeah, that's Golden Gate and Taylor. That's in the Tenderloin. Yeah.
The dissonance
Yeah.
between the people
Going to see Hamilton and what's around them. Yeah.
Golden Gate, the musicians walk out into
Yeah.
pieces on them.
Yep.
It's just
Yeah.
an incredible jarring collision of cultures.
It really is. Yeah, I mean, you've put your finger on it. You know, that's the Tenderloin, and it's the fact that it is right next to these very popular cultural institutions like, Shorenstein, Carol Shorenstein's Hayes' theater there, and it's right next to people passed out and feces and needles and all that is just one of these strange anomalies of San Francisco, and it's really upsets a lot of people with good reason, and I totally understand it. There just are not easy solutions to it. The easy solution would be to remove the whole area to somewhere else, but that's pretty draconian. You'd be taking all these people that have this is their life, and and it's not just the people that you see that are on the streets. One of the things people don't understand about the Tenderloin, they're not all homeless. Those are people that are housed and living in supportive housing, and they have little tiny rooms. They don't want to be in their rooms all the time. So they hang out on the street, and sometimes they do, disturbing things. So there's no easy solution to it. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I know you mentioned the Sierra Nevada project, specifically the Fairmont Island.
Yeah.
What captivates you about that range? And secondarily, out of all the walking tours you did, what place surprised you the most?
Could you repeat the part about the Sierra Nevada? Were you saying what part of it interested me the most?
Captivates you the most about the Sierra Nevada, since you mentioned it?
Oh, yeah, the Sierra. I mean, my family has land that's in the foothills, so I've just spent a lot of time hiking in the Sierras. I mean, it's a magnificent mountain range. And if you ever hiked in places like the Alps, it's very friendly. If you're hiking in the Alps in July and August, you can die. The weather can change in like a day or an hour. The Sierra is extremely predictable. So it's lovely, and it's, unlike European mountain ranges, there's no Campari stands at 10,000 feet. There's no hydroelectric plants. It's pretty virgin. There's a lot and once you get above the tree line especially. So it's a magnificent mountain range. I mean, John Muir was right, he called it the range of light. So, then it has all these interesting connections with San Francisco where, it's sand that washed down from the Sierras ended up becoming sand dunes in San Francisco and things like that. And then you had was your second question is what was my most area that I like walking around in the most?
What place surprised you the most out of all the places you walked?
Oh, boy. Certain place, like there's a weird hill that's way out in the Ocean View neighborhood, which is this unexpected African-American neighborhood in kind of the Sunset. And it's like near Plymouth and Broadview. And there's just this little rise of a park, and it's really charming. It's just one of those things that very few people have ever gone to. But there's just so many things like that. I mean, I really love the whole range of Hawk Hill and Larson Peak and all of the peaks that are around where the numbered avenues cross each other, like the intersection of 15th and 16th Street in the inner Sunset. That's a really fantastic area to walk around in. But once you start digging into obscure places, just so many appear that they all become fascinating. So. Yes?
Hi. So you selected the second chapter to read to us. If there were another chapter that you would encourage someone approaching your book to read, what would that chapter be?
Oh boy, well, I love them all, of course. No, they're all incredible works of genius, and each one is like Shakespeare and the next like Homer. No, I mean, I'm fond of, there's one on the Golden Gate Bridge that I kind of like because it's got a whole little riff actually about Homer in it that's fun. It's kind of literary. The one on weather I like, and yeah, I mean, the one on the Indians, at the end, obviously, any writer, you try to sort of move to a climax at the end of the book. So right at the end, I go back to the first inhabitants, and that's a pretty emotional one. So that one's pretty significant. The one on Aquatic Park and on Telegraph Hill, these are places that are very dear to my heart. So they're towards the end. And the last chapter, of course, you're always, it's like, all jazz musicians say, it doesn't matter what you do in the middle, it's how you start and you end. So, most writers and artists put a whole lot more energy into the beginning and ending of things than anything else. So That's I like the last chapter quite a bit too. Yes.
I'm wondering if there are any neighborhoods in San Francisco that remain a mystery or that you're eager to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to see most things at least in a cursory fashion. It's really hard. There are some maniacs. There was one guy that I think did it for the Chronicle, where he walked every street, and I think he wrote about it. And that's really time-consuming. To do every street, it's really hard. And as I say early in the book, I think if you were to divide the city up into like 1,000-foot grids, I could honestly say I've either walked or put my bike or my car. I'm usually walking or biking on every one of those grids. But no, every single street. So yeah, I mean, there are neighborhoods out on the southern slopes, the northern slopes of Mount San Bruno, right at the border of Daly City in San Francisco, and I do a whole chapter. That's another one of my favorite chapters, is trying to find that border. But you know, there's still quite a few areas around there. And even when I was a taxi driver, that was always a little bit of like, what is this? You know, how does Alamany and San Jose interact? And you know, it was always kind of murky, and it still is kind of murky. So yeah, that's probably my weakest area out there.
Dr. Tenderloin, when you hear what Benioff's idea is versus the people who say that's not such a good idea, can you describe what those two arguments are, which you think is the better?
You mean about Benioff's just new announced thing where he's spending $30 million to study homelessness? I mean, to me, anybody that would argue against that would kind of, frankly, forgive the vulgarity, have their head up their ass. I mean, it's like you cannot go wrong with trying to learn more about this subject. And there's a lot of things that there's obfuscation, and there's things we just don't know. And I think some of the stuff that's going to be found out is not always going to be so easy for what this gentleman called the homeless industrial complex, because I think there's things that are tricky. In the article in the Chronicle today, they cited one guy saying, well, we're going to find out that nobody comes to San Francisco because of the services. I'm not so sure about that. You know, I mean, I've talked to Jeff Kaczynski, who is the head of the homelessness department, and he is not, you know, he's agnostic on that subject too. I think if you really look at it, it's not just the services, it's the lax law enforcement and the weather. There's a lot of things. Homeless people are not entirely stupid. You know, they're drawn. Many of them are obviously very disturbed, but they have agency, and you know, San Francisco is a better place to be homeless than a lot of places. Now, does that mean we should not have services? No. I mean, but it's something that's we're going to have to deal with that as an ongoing issue as we ramp up even more services. And I think, you know, I'm pretty skeptical that, you know, anything is short of much more draconian measures about involuntary confinement and things like that, I don't know if we're prepared to go down that road. I'm not sure that we're going to really, you know, end this problem no matter how much money we throw at it, because a lot of people want to be on the street. They don't want to be in crappy little shelters. It'll never be financially viable to give them their own little homes. If you started to just give people their own little homes, then you create a whole moral hazard thing with working class people that aren't getting that. I mean, it's an incredible can of worms. So I think that, you know, Benioff throwing this money into this is useful, and you know, it'll be helpful. I'm not sure it's going to produce a magic bullet, though. I mean, it's it's the problem from hell, and it's a problem that goes deep into our society, and it goes into our federal housing policy, it goes into endemic racism, it goes into a history of family abuse and neglect. That's really what it is. I mean, almost everybody you see, those people all had terrible families. And there's a whole bunch of societal reasons for that. And so it's anybody that says there's some easy fix for it Because there are things we could do better, like there's these great organizations like Downtown Streets, where they really try to work with homeless people to give them like vouchers. They don't give them money because they'll use them on drugs, but they give them like vouchers for food, and then they have them clean up the streets, so they try to get their self-respect up. It's really good, but the thing is, those programs cream the population. I mean, those are the most functional homeless people. So it's when you get below that level, that's when you've got, these quadruple diagnosed people. What are you going to do with these people? It's just really, really hard. And, nobody knows the answer to it, I don't think. So.
Okay, I have one last
Yes.
question.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the name of your book, Cool Gray City of Love?
Oh, yes. So, Cool Gray City of Love was the title of a poem by the poet laureate of San Francisco in the early 20th century, this kind of forgotten figure named George Sterling. And when I used to play basketball at this Russian Hill court up on Greenwich and Hyde, there was a little plinth that had these marvelous lines from this poem. This was long before I thought of writing this book. And the lines were something like, though the fog be dark and blind, yet her sea fog's touch is kind, and mightier is her caress than is joy and the pain thereof. It's a great line, actually. And her mightier caress is joy and the pain thereof. And great is thy tenderness, cool gray city of love. It's a kind of a purple. He was kind of purple, and there's a reason he's kind of forgotten. But he had some good lines. And the ending of that poem is, and by the way, he was this out of control, kind of ladies' man, drinker, very handsome, ne'er-do-well, played up his whole boho thing, and he ended up committing suicide by taking strychnine in the Bohemian Club rooms when he was 45 years old. So he's not a great role model, but there's some good lines in that poem. So,
Okay, I think that does it. Thank you so
Right.
much for
Thank
a
you very
wonderful
much.
presentation.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
And join us next month for Barry Spitz, who's going to speak about women of the Dipsy race. Thanks so much for coming here this evening.